At last, a voice for the people who pay big government's bills rather than those who make big government's bills. You are listening to Speaking of Taxpayers, sponsored by the 362,000-member National Taxpayers Union here on Gimme Radio. I am your host, Pete Sepp.
And Natasha Altamirano.
Welcome to the second edition of our show. Well, it's been a busy week here in Washington with Congress and the President battling it out over a $1 trillion stimulus package. Don't believe what you've read in the papers, folks, about it being an $800 billion package or a $900 billion package when you figure out the interest payments on all the borrowed money that will fund this stimulus package. It is well over $1 trillion. And most ironically, perhaps, is the news that the Congressional Budget Office, Congress's own nonpartisan fiscal policy analytical arm, concluded that the $1 trillion plus of borrowed money that would be used to fund this stimulus package will, in the long run, actually drag down the private sector, take money out of the economy to the point where any short-term economic stimulus will be all but wiped out. What an ironic result, what a terrible result, even as this package moves forward into enactment, Natasha.
All week in Washington, there's been little talk of savings. It's been spend, spend, spend. But here at NTU, we support a measure that would actually save taxpayers an estimated $2.5 million. H.R. 156 would prevent an automatic $4,700 pay increase for members of Congress in 2010.
And as you know, Natasha, members of Congress already make $174,000 in salary a year, plus cut-rate life and health insurance, a pension plan that is 2 to 3 times more generous than the private sector, an attending physician's office, free parking, a whole host of benefits that most Americans, well, they can't even expect where their next paycheck is going to come from. So, obviously, lawmakers have not yet made a sacrifice in these economically tough times, and it's a very easy thing for them to do. They set themselves up a pay raise mechanism that allows them to get these increases without ever actually having to vote for them. Way back in 1989, lawmakers put into place a law that says each year Congress will get a cost of living adjustment in its pay unless both chambers specifically vote it down. It automatically becomes law. And that's what H.R. 156 aims to change. It's sponsored by Democratic Congressman Harry Mitchell, Republican Congressman Ron Paul, and although the amount is small, we're talking about $2.5 million, it would be a huge symbolic gesture to the American people who are suffering right as we're talking, Natasha.
When was the last time that Congress voted not to receive the pay raise, Pete?
Well, in 2007, when the members of Congress on both sides of the aisle were fighting with each other over passing appropriations bills, they enacted what was called a continuing resolution to just keep the federal government on a stable funding path without making any major decisions on the disposition of programs. And in that bill, they specifically turned down a cost of living adjustment. And so, for the year 2007 at least, congressional salaries remained frozen at their 2006 levels. But the pay raises started right back up again after that, and you'd really have to go back to the mid-1990s for examples of when lawmakers kept their pay frozen.
All right, H.R. 156 would stop an automatic pay increase for members of Congress. Up next on Speaking of Taxpayers, we have NTU Government Affairs Manager Andrew Moylan, our in-house financial guru, talking about the Troubled Asset Relief Program.
And here on our next segment of Speaking of Taxpayers, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP. Is it throwing a tarp on our economic growth? Or do we need to pull the tarp back to see what's actually happening with our tax dollars? Here to explain it all to our listeners here on Give Me Radio is NTU Government Affairs Manager and Financial Industry Guru Andrew Moylan. What about it? The good, the bad, and the ugly of the latest plan from Treasury Secretary Geithner to reform the TARP program. Let's start with the good and the question, is there any?
There is a small amount of good. The small amount of good that's there is that Geithner has always been a little more open to the idea of transparency and openness in the bailout process than Henry Paulson was. And that's a good thing for taxpayers because we need to know more about what's happening with the billions, hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars that are being invested in the financial industry. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of bad and a lot of very, very ugly in the process as well. And most of that involves racking up more costs for taxpayers. Tim Geithner came out today and announced the addition of about another $2 trillion worth of obligations for taxpayers in the process, and that's both bad and ugly. And this Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP that everybody's been talking about, up to this point it has neither purchased troubled assets nor provided any relief. So we'll see if maybe that changes in the future.
Just a note to our listeners here on Speaking of Taxpayers, today is not the air day. We are recording this prior to Sunday, but the plan has been recently released under Secretary Geithner and will continue to be a source of controversy for a number of weeks because, as is the usual in Washington, D.C., we get the news conference, we get a few details leaked, and we don't know exactly how everything is going to shake out until the taxpayers aren't watching.
Well, and unfortunately the way things seem to be panning out over the last couple of weeks is markets have not liked much of any of this, despite the fact that the banks have been recipients of huge amounts of money, because there's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the market, and a lot of that has been fostered by the actions of the Treasury Department and the President and the Congress. Nobody really knows what's going to happen next, and so there are a lot of investors that are very shaky, that are worried about what the future holds.
Do you think, Andrew, that a lot of the problems with the federal intervention in the financial industry began with the downfall of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two government-sponsored enterprises that back up most of the residential mortgages in this country?
Absolutely. You know, when you look at it, really the ultimate problem here, the core of this issue is housing, is the housing crisis, and it all kind of cascaded from there. And one of the biggest issues in the housing crisis is the fact that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were these government-sponsored enterprises that were allowed to operate in this la-la land in between private company and government entity, where they had the implicit backing of taxpayers, and so they could take on way more risk than any private company could ever manage. And what we ended up seeing was a lot of reckless lending as a result. And that reckless lending meant lending to people who couldn't pay their bills in a down market. And so now when those bills aren't getting paid, we're seeing all of the financial instruments that are tied to that start collapsing as well. So that really is probably one of the initial stages that had policymakers listen to NTU and others who were warning of it, that maybe we'd be in a different situation today.
That's Fannie and Freddie's corporate motto, folks. Privatizing the profits, but socializing the risk. What do you think, Natasha?
Well, I had another question for Andrew related to this. Part of Secretary Geithner's plan was to introduce a, quote, comprehensive housing program. But he did say in his speech today that the details of that will be announced in the next few weeks. Do you know any of what that might entail? Is it going to be good or bad for taxpayers, or very ugly?
Well, it's unfortunately likely to be pretty bad. What Geithner has talked about is the idea of a lot of loan modification, which is something that on paper sounds good to people, the idea that you can write down the value of a loan to a more sustainable rate for somebody. But what we've seen is in a lot of the pilot programs, loan modification simply hasn't worked. I believe it was somewhere around 50% of people who participated in one loan modification program were defaulting again within 6 months. And so there's a real question as to whether or not that's going to be effective, regardless of the legal and constitutional issues that are involved as well, and those are very serious. And we haven't heard how Geithner and the Obama administration plan to address those.
Yeah, that seems to be indicative of a traditional pattern. The federal government has never been a good lender of first resort, much less last resort, when you look at the Small Business Administration loans. You look at the loans to farmers. You look at the loans for advertising and startup businesses overseas. The default rates tend to be huge, much worse than the private sector, and taxpayers are the ones left holding the bag.
You know, that brings up sort of an interesting point. I think a lot of people look at the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the TARP, and say, well, we've spent $350 billion thus far and are going to spend many, many more hundreds of billions beyond this, and yet we've seen no improvement in the economic situation, really. Why is that? And I think that it all comes back to a theory from none other than Milton Friedman, somebody who's far smarter than anyone in this room, who said that anytime you get a temporary increase in your income, if you're getting a $500 rebate check or something of that nature from the government, that you don't change your consumption habits, you don't change your patterns because it's temporary. And so what we're seeing with these banks is something similar. They're getting temporary infusions of huge amounts of money, but what they're doing is simply using it to plug holes in their balance sheets rather than lend out extra money or do something that would improve the economic situation.
Tell me about the effect of what was called the Community Reinvestment Act on some of these financial institutions. Did that contribute to all of this meltdown?
I think it was a contributing factor. It was a relatively small one in the grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things, I think that the most important few factors were, I think the most important was the Federal Reserve, which had an extraordinarily loose monetary policy. We had very low interest rates in this country, particularly from 2003 to 2005, which facilitated a lot of the reckless lending. We talked about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the reckless behavior that they engaged in. And there are other things that were contributing factors as well. And one of those was the Community Reinvestment Act, which basically encouraged banks to lend to folks who otherwise may not be able to qualify based on standards within a neighborhood. And so it was a minor thing because the Community Reinvestment Act has existed for decades now. They modified it in the early 1990s to be a little more stringent, and so it certainly helped to create the culture that proliferated loans to folks who couldn't afford them, but it was, I think, a smaller factor in the grand scheme.
Well, speaking of borrowing and lending practices, the Senate Republicans had a proposal when the stimulus bill debate was going on to try and cover the spread between interest rates that people might have gotten home mortgages at and a level of 4%. In other words, they were guaranteeing that virtually anyone in the country could refinance their mortgage at a 4% interest rate, and the federal government would back the banks for whatever was between that and the interest rate originally charged. That amendment was defeated. Tell me why NTU was so adamantly against it.
Well, that was a very bad and very ugly amendment for a lot of reasons, but the main reason is that it amounted to nationalizing every mortgage in the country virtually. We have 55 million mortgages in this country, most of which are actually still performing. People are not in foreclosure, are not delinquent in their payments, and so what this would have done is taken all of those people and transitioned them to a 4% rate, which may sound good on paper, but when you actually analyze it, we're talking about enormous taxpayer costs that are involved in the process, because a lot of these lenders are counting on an income of 6.5%, for example, on a loan, and 4% is not something that's going to pay their bills, that's going to blow bigger holes in their balance sheets than they have today. And so we opposed it for many, many reasons, but primarily because we're talking about the federal government owning all of these mortgages, which we think is a terrible idea, and we think was a huge contributor to the problem with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were backing all of these mortgages. So, you know, more of the same is not the answer.
And it all comes back to Fannie and Freddie again. Shame on the Republicans who supported this amendment, saying, well, Washington, D.C. has taken over Fannie and Freddie, and so we're already technically backing and owning all those mortgages anyway, so as long as we do, why don't we fiddle some more with them and start giving out guaranteed low interest rates, la, la, la. The big problem, of course, was from the very beginning, instead of actually getting a hold of Fannie and Freddie and divesting them, selling them off to the private sector, the federal government held on to them. They are in what's called conservatorship, and that is a bad deal for taxpayers. Trillions of dollars that we still have to back.
we ought to be divesting ourselves of those resources rather than adding to them. That's the point that we made in a lot of the material that we put out on this and other issues, and I think it's an important point to keep in mind.
Back to the issue of transparency. If you were Secretary Geithner, Andrew, what would you do to improve transparency so taxpayers know where this money is going? He's talked about creating a website, financialstability.gov, that would give the American people the transparency they deserve, in his words. What would you do? What kinds of information would you include on that site to improve it?
I think that that's a good start. Having a website where people can actually track this information in a reasonable way is a good thing, rather than forcing a lot of the watchdog groups like us to go out there and track down the information. And even then, we have very little information about the decision-making process. So one of the things that I would like to see Geithner do is give us an idea of that decision-making process, give an idea of who is actually asking for these injections, how much they're asking for, the people who end up getting rejected, the people who end up getting accepted, what their balance sheets are looking like, why they need this money. That's a major part of it. One of the other things that I think is particularly important that we've talked about is trying to have some sort of idea of who's actually servicing this bailout aid, because the Treasury Department simply doesn't have enough people in it to sort through all of these requests on their own, and so they have to contract a lot of this stuff out. And what's happened in the very limited disclosure that's happened about who's servicing this bailout aid, all of the contract details have been excised, so we don't know how much they're getting paid to do it, we don't know what their qualifications are to be doing it, and we don't know what sort of political connections they may have had that helped them in that process. And we need to know all of these data points so that we can paint a more accurate picture for taxpayers and we can figure out where that money's going.
What has NTU been doing regarding the bailout to help taxpayers? What kinds of efforts have we been engaging in?
Well, the primary thing that we've done is with our friends at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, we started a website called beyondbailouts.org. And what the purpose of Beyond Bailouts is to give people an idea of how we got where we are today, what caused this. And obviously that's a very complicated question, and it's something that's going to be determined with more clarity over time, but we have some pretty good ideas of what brought us here. And also suggesting some common sense reforms for that, some real reforms of the core problems, not just adding to them like this Republican 4% mortgage plan, addressing the real issues with Fannie and Freddie, with the Federal Reserve policy, with the tax code, things like that that have been a problem. And it's also been a place where we've aggregated a lot of content from other conservative watchdog groups out there, people like the Heritage Foundation and the Club for Growth and others who have been involved in this. This is a place where they've been blogging and putting information up so folks can keep themselves apprised of the situation. And on the transparency angle in particular, we've been very active with a lot of groups, both left and right. There are a lot of folks on the left of the political spectrum who we may disagree with on a lot of issues, but we're in pretty close agreement on the fact that we need some real transparency in the bailout, that we need to have a much better idea of how these dollars are being spent than we've ever had before.
So the best piece of advice to Secretary Geithner, visit Bailouts.
Visit beyondbailouts.org. I'd be ecstatic if we could get Tim Geithner as a regular reader.
That's right. Visit beyondbailouts.org. Andrew Moylan, the man with the plan for the financial rescue of the United States, thank you for walking all the way down the long corridor of NTU's offices to join us here on Speaking of Taxpayers on Gimme Radio. We'll see you soon.
My pleasure.
Well, now that we've gotten your blood boiling a little bit over the possibility that the TARP program may have even worse oversight under Treasury Secretary Geithner, we're going to turn up the heat a little bit more. Unfortunately, folks, I know this is not a great thing on a Sunday when you're trying to relax, but this is information that we simply cannot keep to ourselves. This is a feature known as Outrage of the Week, where we spotlight the worst examples of waste, fraud, and abuse in state and local government. And in this broadcast, we are discussing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Full disclosure, folks, ever since I was a kid, I've dreamed of going into space. I love the fact that we're planning on resettling in the moon, that we may go to Mars, that we may explore the planets and look for others beyond our solar system. But Is NASA the agency that can get us there? The evidence suggests no way. Recent analyses in the Los Angeles Times and Washington Post have shown that most of NASA's projects suffer from some kind of problems, many of them severe problems in cost overruns and schedule delays. How bad is it? Well, how about a 30% cost overrun on the Glory satellite program, which is meant to examine solar effects on Earth's climate? A big poster child for problems is the Mars Science Laboratory. We've already sent small rovers to Mars to run about on the surface of the planet and take various measurements. This one would be a bigger rover with a lot more instruments on it. And unfortunately, the price tag has zoomed. Once conceived at $650 million. We may very well see the eventual cost quadruple to $2.3 billion or more. And there's still another big shocker. The Congressional Budget Office has taken a look at NASA's project to build a rocket capable of returning to the moon. That could miss its budget target by $7 billion. Incredibly, though, this is a pattern that has been going on for years. Ever since 1995 or so, NASA has been on what is called the high risk list. That is a list maintained by the Government Accountability Office of agencies, projects, or contracts that are most at risk of wasted tax dollars. NASA's been there for a long time and shows no sign of getting off that list. You can take a look back to other projects like the International Space Station, which had to be scaled down several times just to keep the project under $150 billion. This is a real problem that NASA seems unable to overcome. They seem experienced in working with zero-gravity environments, but they don't understand the gravity of fiscal mismanagement. What do you think about that, Natasha?
Well, I think it's preposterous that NASA continues to receive money despite all these projects coming in way over budget and way behind schedule. Unfortunately, it seems that some lawmakers and government bureaucrats believe that the problem here is not enough money, so they continue to funnel money down the drain.
Yes, and they've even appropriated a couple $100 million more in the stimulus package. It's almost as if they're rewarding the agency for its incompetence.
And even worse, the watchdogs are asleep.
Yeah, absolutely. There are offices at most major federal agencies called the Inspector General. What Inspectors General do is keep a reasonable tab on the way money is being spent, not necessarily looking at what's a priority and what isn't, but whether the laws and basic contracting procedures are being followed. Well, NASA's Inspector General has been falling down on the job. There were outside auditors from another government agency who looked at NASA's IG office. They found that the government-wide rate for recovery of improper payments was 26 times better than NASA's. A real difficulty there in getting off their duffs and getting money back for taxpayers. In fact, one of the private recovery audit contractors who are hired to go through NASA's books and do basic things like, match up receipts with payments and make sure everything is proper, well, they are suing NASA because the space agency will not turn over all the records necessary to complete this audit. NASA is saying, we don't want to bother our customers with this kind of record keeping. That seems to be a little backwards in my mind. The customers are the United States taxpayers. They are the ones owed the refund. NASA's people that are spending the money are contractors, not customers. Somehow NASA's leadership needs to understand that, and if they won't, maybe it's time to get new leaders.
Well, what can be done, Pete? What should Congress do to solve this?
Quite clearly, there needs to be a top-to-bottom review of NASA's expenditures and contract management procedures. We can't afford, whether times are this bad or even in good times, to be wasting billions of dollars on money that could otherwise be used to reduce the deficit or provide tax relief or even fund better space exploration programs. Very clearly, throwing more money at the problem is not the answer.
Well, we're nearing the end of this segment of Speaking of Taxpayers. Now that we've gotten you worked up further, we want to end on a more positive note. NTU's Standing Together Taxpayer Grant Program, which we launched last year to help taxpayer activists at the state and local level fight big government bureaucrats. Last year, we awarded 9 grants to recipients at both the state and local levels: Florida Taxpayers Union, Kentucky Taxpayers United, Mississippi Forward, Missouri Liberty Coalition, Taxpayers Union of Louisiana, Bay County Taxpayers Association in Michigan, Clark County Taxpayers and Property Owners Association in Georgia, Edenville's Concerned Citizens also in Michigan, and the Raymond, New Hampshire Taxpayers Association in, of course, New Hampshire. This year, we awarded our 10th grant winner to the Illinois Alliance for Growth, who has been very active already in opposing a 42% gas tax hike in the state.
This is a very, very innovative program. No one else on the public policy scene really does this. What we are trying to do here is mobilize citizens to go into their communities and fight back against big government right where they live. This is an important program because all too many times there are people out there, no doubt listeners on Gimme Radio, who are saying, I want to start a tax revolt. But then the next question, the very next thing is, well, how in the world do I do it? We have created the Standing Together Grant Program to answer that question, to not only provide expert assistance all the way through the formation of the organization, but the financial resources to start it out. Seed money, if you will. Johnny Appleseed spread apple trees all over the United States. Well, we're spreading the seeds of liberty and tax revolt across the United States, and this program is very important.
And recipients don't just get money, they get expert advice from NTU staff and guidance along the way. Recipients also receive free registration to our biennial National Taxpayers Conference, scheduled for this June 11th through 13th, just outside Washington, D.C. at the Crystal City Hyatt Regency Hotel.
It's a great event. People will hear not only from policymakers and insiders in the taxpayer movement, they can get practical training sessions on everything from recruiting members to media relations. They'll also get great opportunities to socialize and learn from veterans of the pro-taxpayer movement. We are running a special right now, $99 of an early bird rate. That gets you into 2 receptions, 2 meals, all conference materials. A great bargain, but it won't last, which is why people need to go to ntu.org and sign up right away.
Visitors to our website can also get information on our Standing Together grant program, including an application. Once again, that's ntu.org. Well, this just about wraps it up for Speaking of Taxpayers today. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Natasha Altamirano.
And I'm your host, Pete Sepp. Remember, you have the power to fight the power if you speak truth to power. And the way we do that is through Speaking of Taxpayers. Join us next week. Until then, so long.